one son lost to rope and fire, and a mother who decided that if the law would not deliver justice, then she would become the law herself. In the spring of 1987, the small mining town of Harlan Ridge, Kentucky, had a population of just under 3,000 souls. Nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, where fog rolled through the valleys like ghostly rivers and the coal dust settled on everything like a permanent shadow, this town had survived generations of hardship. The mines had given life to Harlan Ridge, but they had also taken it away, one cave-in at a time, one black lung diagnosis at a time. The people here were hardened by necessity. They buried their dead, wiped their tears, and went back to work the next morning because that was the only way to survive. The Collins family had been part of Harlan Ridge for 5 generations. They were not wealthy. They were not powerful in the traditional sense, but they were respected, feared, and left alone, which in a place like this was its own form of power. The matriarch of this family was a woman named Agnes Collins, 62 years old, with silver hair she kept in a tight bun and eyes the color of mountain slate. She had buried a husband to the mines when she was 34. She had raised 4 children alone, working as a seamstress, a cook, a cleaner, whatever it took to keep food on the table. She had never asked anyone for help, and she had never forgiven anyone who wronged her family. Her youngest son was named Elijah. He was 24 years old in the spring of 1987, tall and lean with his mother's grey eyes and his father's quiet strength. Elijah worked at the Blackwood Mining Company, the same company that had taken his father's life 2 decades earlier. He was not bitter about it. He understood that the mountains gave and the mountains took, and a man either accepted that or he left. Elijah had no intention of leaving. Harlan Ridge was his home, the Collins land, 20 acres of rocky soil and dense forest was his inheritance. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he had begun to dream of a future that looked different from his past. Elijah had fallen in love with a woman named Sarah Whitmore. She was 22, the daughter of a schoolteacher, with auburn hair and a laugh that could fill a room. They had been together for 2 years, meeting in secret at first because Sarah's father did not approve of the Collins family. Old man Whitmore believed the rumors that had followed the Collins name for generations, whispers of violence, of feuds settled in blood, of a family that lived by its own code rather than the laws. But Sarah did not care about rumors. She cared about Elijah, about the way he listened when she spoke, about the gentleness in his hands when he touched her face, about the future he described when they lay together in the tall grass behind the old mill. In March of 1987, Sarah discovered she was pregnant. She told Elijah on a Sunday afternoon, tears streaming down her face because she did not know how he would react. But Elijah had simply smiled, pulled her close, and whispered that this was the best news he had ever received. They made plans to marry. They would tell their families together. They would build a small house on the Collins land, near the creek where Elijah had played as a boy. They would raise their child in these mountains, teach them the old ways, give them roots that went deep into the Appalachian soil. But Harlan Ridge was not a place where happiness went unchallenged, and there were men in this town who had been watching Elijah Collins for a long time, waiting for an excuse to do what they had always wanted to do. The Dawson family had hated the Collins clan for 3 generations. The origin of the feud was so old that no one remembered it exactly. Some said it started over land, others said it was a woman. A few claimed it was a debt that was never repaid. Whatever the cause, the hatred had calcified into something permanent, passed down from father to son like a poisoned inheritance. The current head of the Dawson family was a man named Earl Dawson, 51 years old, a former mine foreman who had lost his job when the Blackwood Company downsized in 1985. Earl blamed the Collins family for his misfortune, though the connection existed only in his fevered imagination. He spent his days drinking at the Iron Horse Tavern and his nights nursing grudges that had grown into obsessions. Earl had 3 sons, Marcus, 28, Dale, 25, and Tommy, 22. All 3 had inherited their father's hatred and his talent for violence. Marcus had served 2 years in the state penitentiary for aggravated assault. Dale was known throughout Harlan Ridge as a man who enjoyed causing pain. And Tommy, the youngest, was perhaps the most dangerous of all because he was smart enough to plan what his brothers were too impulsive to think through. On the night of April 14, 1987, Elijah Collins made a mistake that would cost him his life. He stopped at the Iron Horse Tavern after his shift at the mine, something he rarely did because he knew the Dawsons drank there. But he was tired, his throat was dry from coal dust, and he thought one beer could not hurt. He sat at the far end of the bar, kept his head down, and minded his own business. But Tommy Dawson noticed him, and Tommy had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. It started with words. Tommy walked over to Elijah, stood too close, and made a comment about Sarah Whitmore. The exact words would later be disputed, but witnesses agreed that Tommy said something about Sarah's honor, something designed to provoke. Elijah did not take the bait. He finished his beer, placed money on the counter, and turned to leave. But Tommy grabbed his arm, and when Elijah pulled away, Tommy stumbled backward and fell against a table. In the logic of men like the Dawsons, this was an unforgivable offense. It did not matter that Tommy had initiated the contact. It did not matter that Elijah had been trying to leave peacefully. What mattered was that a Collins had put a Dawson on the ground in front of witnesses, and that shame demanded blood. Earl Dawson heard about the incident within the hour. By midnight, he had gathered not only his 3 sons, but also 8 other men, relatives and friends, who owed the Dawsons favors or shared their hatred of the Collins family. 12 men in total. They armed themselves with rifles, shotguns, chains, and rope. They loaded into 4 pickup trucks and drove out to the Collins property, their headlights cutting through the mountain darkness like the eyes of predators. Agnes Collins was asleep when she heard the trucks coming up the dirt road. She had lived long enough to know the sound of trouble. She woke her daughter Martha, 35, who lived in the main house with her. She told Martha to take the children, Martha's 2 young sons, and hide in the root cellar, behind the barn. Then Agnes loaded her late husband's shotgun and stepped onto the front porch. What she saw made her blood run cold. A dozen men with torches and weapons, their faces twisted with hatred, surrounding the small cabin where Elijah lived, 200 yards from the main house. She heard shouting. She heard Elijah's voice, calm at first, then frightened. She heard Sarah screaming because Sarah had been staying with Elijah that night, a secret they had kept from both their families. Agnes started running toward the cabin, but she was 62 years old, and the distance was too great. By the time she reached the edge of the clearing, they had already dragged Elijah out of his home. Sarah was on her knees in the dirt, held back by 2 men, sobbing and begging them to stop. Earl Dawson was giving a speech, something about honor and justice and teaching the Collins family their place. But Agnes did not hear the words. All she could see was the rope they were tying around her son's neck. She raised the shotgun and fired into the air. The men turned. For a moment everything stopped. Agnes screamed at them to let her son go. She threatened. She pleaded. She offered them money, land, anything they wanted. But Earl Dawson just laughed. He said this had been coming for a long time. He said the Collins family needed to learn that they could not touch a Dawson without consequences. And then he gave the order. Agnes watched as they threw the rope over a thick oak branch. She watched as they pulled her son off his feet. She watched as Elijah struggled, his legs kicking, his hands clawing at the rope around his throat. She fired again, but they had taken cover, and the shotgun only held 2 shells. She was out of ammunition, out of options, out of time. Elijah Collins took 4 minutes to die. His mother watched every second of it. When it was over, the men doused the cabin with gasoline and set it ablaze. Sarah Whitmore was still inside. They held Agnes back, made her watch the flames climb into the night sky, made her listen to the screams that eventually stopped. Then they left. 12 men in 4 trucks disappearing down the mountain road as if they had simply attended a community meeting rather than committed an atrocity. The sheriff arrived at dawn. His name was Roy Patterson, and he had held his position for 18 years by understanding exactly how power worked in Harlan Ridge. He surveyed the scene with the detached professionalism of a man who had already decided what his report would say. The cabin had burned to the foundation. Elijah's body hung from the oak tree, swaying slightly in the morning breeze. Sarah Whitmore's remains were found in the ashes, burned beyond recognition. Agnes Collins stood in the clearing, still wearing her nightgown, still holding the empty shotgun. She had not moved in 6 hours. Her daughter Martha had emerged from hiding and now stood beside her, weeping silently. The 2 young grandsons clung to their mother's skirts, too young to understand what had happened, but old enough to know that something terrible had occurred. Sheriff Patterson approached Agnes with his hat in his hands. He expressed his condolences. He promised a thorough investigation. He assured her that justice would be served. But Agnes had lived in these mountains for 62 years, and she knew exactly what his words meant. Nothing. They meant nothing at all. The investigation lasted 3 weeks. 12 men were interviewed. All 12 had alibis that vouched for each other. No physical evidence could be conclusively linked to any suspect. The fire had destroyed whatever might have been found in the cabin. Elijah's death was ruled an accident by 3 out of 5 jury members during the coroner's inquest, with 2 dissenting opinions that were noted but overruled. Sarah Whitmore's death was attributed to a tragic house fire of unknown origin. The case was closed. The people of Harlan Ridge knew the truth. Everyone knew. They whispered about it in the general store, at the church, in the mines. They knew Earl Dawson and his sons had murdered Elijah Collins and Sarah Whitmore. They knew the sheriff had looked the other way. They knew that justice had not been served, because justice was a word that meant different things to different people in different places. And in Harlan Ridge, it meant whatever the powerful said it meant. Agnes Collins knew this better than anyone. She had known it before the investigation even began. She had known it when she saw Sheriff Patterson's face that first morning, the way he avoided her eyes, the way he spoke in rehearsed phrases. She had known that her son's killers would go free, that she would have to live the rest of her life watching Earl Dawson walk the streets of her town, seeing Marcus and Dale and Tommy Dawson laugh and drink at the Iron Horse Tavern, knowing that they had taken everything from her and faced no consequences whatsoever. For 3 months after the case was closed, Agnes Collins did not leave her property. Her daughter Martha ran errands into town, bought supplies, handled the family's business. Agnes stayed in her bedroom, emerging only for meals, speaking only when necessary. The people of Harlan Ridge assumed she had retreated into grief. They assumed she was broken. They assumed they would never hear from Agnes Collins again. They were wrong. What Agnes was doing in those 3 months was not grieving. She was planning. She was remembering every face she had seen in the torchlight. She was memorizing the names of every man who had stood in that clearing and watched her son die. She was studying their routines, their habits, where they lived, who they loved, what they cared about. She was preparing. Agnes Collins had never been a violent woman. She had raised her children to work hard, speak honestly, and treat others with respect. She had taught them that vengeance was the Lord's business, not theirs. She had believed these things her entire life, but that life had ended on the night of April 14th, 1987. The woman who emerged from that bedroom 3 months later was someone different. She was someone who had looked into the abyss and decided to become the abyss herself. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel, because the story of Agnes Collins is about to enter a darkness that few have ever witnessed, and you will want to follow every moment of what happens next. The first, a man died on July 17th, 1987. His name was Curtis Wade, 44 years old, a cousin of Earl Dawson who had been present on the night of the lynching. Curtis lived alone in a small house on the edge of town, working odd jobs since the mines had let him go 2 years earlier. He had a reputation as a mean drunk, the kind of man who started fights he could not finish and held grudges he could not remember. He had been the one holding Sarah Whitmore when she tried to run to Elijah. Agnes remembered his face. She remembered the way he had laughed. Curtis was found in his living room by a neighbor who came to check on him after he missed their weekly poker game. He was seated in his favorite chair, facing the television, which was still playing static because the station had gone off the air hours earlier. There was no visible cause of death, no wounds, no signs of struggle. The coroner performed an autopsy and concluded that Curtis had died of heart failure, likely caused by years of heavy drinking and poor health. The death was ruled natural causes. No one connected it to Agnes Collins. Why would they? Curtis was unhealthy. Curtis was a drunk. Curtis had been living on borrowed time for years. His death was unremarkable, forgettable, just another sad story in a town full of sad stories. The second man died 9 days later. His name was Vernon Price, 38, a farmhand who worked on Earl Dawson's property. Vernon had been one of the men holding the rope. Agnes remembered his thick hands, his blank expression, the methodical way he had pulled on the hemp as if he were hauling cargo rather than ending a human life. Vernon was a follower, not a leader. He did what he was told without question. That did not make him innocent. Vernon was found in his barn, hanging from a rafter. A suicide note was discovered nearby, scrawled in shaky handwriting, confessing to his participation in the Collins murders and expressing remorse he could no longer bear. The note described his guilt in vivid detail, his nightmares, his inability to look at himself in the mirror. Sheriff Patterson was relieved. A confession and a suicide made everything cleaner. The case was already closed, but this provided additional validation. Vernon Price had been consumed by his own conscience. Justice, in its own twisted way, had been served. What no one realized was that Vernon Price had been illiterate. He could barely write his own name, much less compose a detailed confession. But Sheriff Patterson did not investigate closely. He had no reason to. A dead man who confessed to a crime the sheriff had already declared unsolvable was not a problem. It was a gift. Agnes had learned many things in her 62 years. She had learned how to sew, how to cook, how to raise children alone, how to survive on almost nothing. But in the 3 months since her son's death, she had learned new skills. She had learned how to move silently through the forest at night. She had learned how to pick locks and enter homes without leaving traces. She had learned which plants in the Appalachian woods were poisonous and how to extract their essences. She had learned patience, the predator's patience, the ability to wait for exactly the right moment. Curtis Wade had drunk poisoned whiskey. Agnes had entered his home while he was at the bar, found his bottle, and added a carefully measured dose of foxglove extract. Foxglove was common in these mountains. Its symptoms mimicked heart failure. No toxicology screen would detect it unless someone specifically tested for digitalis compounds, and there was no reason to order such a test for a known alcoholic with heart problems. Vernon Price had not hanged himself. Agnes had surprised him in his barn, incapacitated him with chloroform she had purchased through a mail-order medical supply company under a false name, and staged the scene. The confession note she had written herself after studying his signature on documents at the county clerk's office. It was not a perfect forgery, but it was close enough for a sheriff who did not want to look closely. 2 men down, 10 to go. The summer of 1987 passed slowly in Harlan Ridge. The deaths of Curtis Wade and Vernon Price were discussed briefly and then forgotten. People had their own problems. The mines were laying off workers. The economy was struggling. No one had time to mourn men who had not been particularly mourned when they were alive. Agnes Collins resumed her public life. She attended church on Sundays. She shopped at the general store. She nodded politely when neighbors offered condolences about her son. She appeared to be a woman who had made peace with her tragedy, who had found a way to move forward. The people of Harlan Ridge admired her strength. They spoke about her resilience, her dignity, her grace under pressure. They had no idea that behind those slate-grey eyes, a calculating intelligence was tracking every movement of the men who had killed her son. The third man was Marcus Dawson, Earl's eldest son. Marcus was not going to be as easy as Curtis or Vernon. He was younger, stronger, more alert. He lived in the Dawson family compound, a cluster of houses and outbuildings where multiple family members resided. He rarely went anywhere alone. He was paranoid, which was ironic given that he had participated in murdering someone and escaped all legal consequences. Perhaps he sensed that consequences could come in other forms. Agnes watched Marcus. For weeks, she learned his patterns. He worked at a sawmill 20 miles from town, driving there and back on the same mountain road every day. He stopped at a roadside diner for lunch. He drank at the Iron Horse 3 nights a week. He had a girlfriend in the next county whom he visited every other Saturday. He was a creature of habit, which would be his undoing. On August 23, 1987, Marcus Dawson's truck went off Widow's Ridge, a notorious stretch of mountain road with hairpin turns and steep drop-offs. His brakes had failed. The truck plummeted 200 feet into a ravine, exploding on impact. Marcus was burned beyond recognition. The accident was investigated by the State Highway Patrol, who concluded that Marcus had been driving too fast for conditions and lost control when his brakes gave out. Mechanical failure, a tragic but not uncommon occurrence on these dangerous mountain roads. What the investigators did not know was that someone had tampered with the brake lines while Marcus's truck sat in the sawmill parking lot. Agnes had learned about automotive systems from library books. She had practiced on junked vehicles in a salvage yard 2 counties over. She had become, in her own words, a student of destruction. Earl Dawson stood at his son's grave with a face like carved granite. He did not weep. Men like Earl Dawson did not weep. But something in him shifted that day, something that had been dormant since the night of the lynching. He began to wonder if the Collins family had friends he did not know about. He began to wonder if someone was taking revenge. He mentioned his suspicions to Sheriff Patterson, but the sheriff dismissed them. 3 deaths, 3 different causes, no evidence of foul play. Coincidence happened. People died. That was life in the mountains. But Earl was not convinced. He doubled the security at the Dawson compound. He told his remaining sons, Dale and Tommy, to travel in pairs. He started carrying a pistol everywhere he went. He was afraid, and he did not know why. He did not know that the woman he should have been watching was the same woman who came to church every Sunday and sat 3 pews behind him, her head bowed in prayer, her lips moving silently as she counted the names of the men still living who had murdered her son. The 4th man was not a Dawson. His name was Lee Harmon, 52, a distant relative of Earl's wife who had joined the mob because he enjoyed violence and had nothing better to do. Lee was a butcher at the local grocery store, a position that gave him access to knives and a certain comfort with blood. He had been one of the men who set fire to Elijah's cabin. Agnes remembered seeing him splash gasoline on the wooden walls, his face illuminated by the flames, grinning like a child at a bonfire. Lee Harmon disappeared on September 4th, 1987. He left for work in the morning and never arrived. His truck was found abandoned on a logging road 15 miles from town. A search party was organized, led by Sheriff Patterson, who was beginning to feel that these mounting incidents were not as disconnected as he had initially believed. They searched the woods for 3 days. They found nothing. Lee Harmon's body was discovered 6 months later by a group of hunters. It was deep in the forest, in a ravine that no search party had thought to check. The remains were skeletal by then, scattered by animals. The coroner could not determine a cause of death. Missing person, presumed deceased by misadventure. Another file closed, another name crossed off Agnes Collins's list. By October 1987, 4 of the 12 men were dead. The people of Harlan Ridge did not connect the deaths. Why would they? Curtis had heart failure. Vernon committed suicide. Marcus had a car accident. Lee went missing, probably got drunk and fell into a ravine. These things happened. Life was hard, and death was common. No one suspected that a 62-year-old grandmother was methodically eliminating the men who had wronged her family. But Earl Dawson suspected. He felt it in his bones, a cold certainty that something was hunting his people. He could not prove it. He could not even articulate it clearly. But he knew, the way prey knows when a predator is watching from the darkness. He started drinking more. He started sleeping less. He saw Agnes Collins at church and noticed for the first time how she looked at him. Her eyes held nothing. No hatred, no fear, no emotion of any kind. They were empty, patient, like the eyes of a snake waiting for its moment to strike. Earl went to Sheriff Patterson and demanded action. He accused Agnes Collins of murdering his son and the others. Patterson listened, took notes, and then explained patiently that there was no evidence linking Agnes to any crime. Marcus died in a car accident, confirmed by state investigators. Vernon committed suicide with a note in his own handwriting. Curtis had a heart attack. Lee got lost in the woods. What exactly did Earl want the sheriff to do? Earl wanted him to arrest Agnes Collins. He wanted her brought in for questioning. He wanted her home searched, her belongings seized, her life turned inside out until they found something, anything, that could prove she was responsible. But Patterson refused. He could not arrest a grieving mother on the basis of hunches and paranoia. He told Earl to calm down, to grieve his son properly, to stop looking for conspiracies where none existed. Earl left, the sheriff's office convinced that Patterson was either corrupt or incompetent. He did not know that the sheriff was simply doing what he had always done, taking the path of least resistance, avoiding conflicts he could not win, protecting a status quo that benefited men like himself. Patterson did not suspect Agnes Collins because the idea was absurd. An old woman killing strong men. It was the stuff of folk tales, not reality. But reality was about to become much stranger than any folk tale. Dale Dawson was the 5th man on Agnes's list. Earl's middle son was 25 years old, with a reputation for cruelty that exceeded even his brother Marcus's. Dale had been the one who suggested using fire to destroy the evidence. Dale had been the one who threw the first torch. Dale had laughed as the cabin burned, as Sarah Whitmore's screams echoed through the night. Agnes remembered his laugh. She heard it in her dreams. Dale was more cautious than his brother had been. He traveled with armed friends. He varied his routes. He checked his vehicle every morning for tampering. He was smart enough to know that someone might be targeting his family, even if he could not identify the threat. But caution has limits. A man cannot be alert every moment of every day. Eventually, attention lapses, guards come down, and in that moment of weakness, death finds its opening. On October 31st, 1987, Dale Dawson attended a Halloween party at a farmhouse outside town. It was a gathering of friends and acquaintances, people who shared Dale's appetites for alcohol and violence. The party went late into the night. By 2 in the morning, Dale was thoroughly intoxicated. His friends tried to convince him to sleep on the couch and drive home in the morning. But Dale was stubborn. He insisted he was fine. He got in his truck and headed home. He never arrived. The next morning, Dale's truck was found parked on the side of the road, engine running, headlights on, driver's door open. There was no sign of Dale. No sign of struggle, no blood, no damage, nothing to indicate what had happened. It was as if he had simply stopped his truck, opened the door, and walked into the darkness. The search for Dale Dawson lasted a week. Sheriff Patterson called in resources from neighboring counties. They used dogs, helicopters, search grids that covered hundreds of acres of mountain forest. They found nothing. Dale Dawson had vanished as completely as if the earth had swallowed him whole. Earl Dawson, aged 10 years in that week. He stopped eating. He stopped speaking to anyone except his youngest son, Tommy. He sat on his porch with a rifle across his lap, staring at the tree line, waiting for an enemy he could not see. His wife tried to comfort him, but Earl was beyond comfort. 2 of his sons were dead. A third was missing. And he knew with absolute certainty that Agnes Collins was responsible. He went to her home. He drove up the dirt road to the Collins property, armed with a pistol and a shotgun, prepared to do what the law would not do. He was going to confront her. He was going to force her to confess. And then he was going to kill her. Consequences be damned. But when he arrived, Agnes was sitting on her front porch, a cup of tea in her hands, as if she had been expecting him. She did not reach for a weapon. She did not call for help. She simply looked at him with those empty grey eyes and asked if he would like to join her for tea. Earl stood in her, yard, his weapons drawn, his heart pounding. He screamed at her. He accused her of killing his sons. He demanded to know where Dale was. He threatened to burn down her house the way they had burned down Elijah's cabin. He was shaking with rage, with grief, with fear. Agnes listened. When he finished, she set down her teacup and spoke in a voice that was calm, measured, and utterly devoid of emotion. She said she understood his pain. She said she knew what it was like to watch someone you love die while others stood by and did nothing. She said she wished she could help him find his son, but she had no idea where Dale was. And then she said something that made Earl's blood run cold. She said, "Earl, have you ever thought about what it means to wait, to know that something terrible is coming and be unable to stop it, to count the days, the hours, the minutes, knowing that each one brings you closer to the end?" Earl raised his shotgun. His finger was on the trigger. Every instinct told him to fire, to end this woman who had destroyed his family, but something stopped him. Call it cowardice, call it doubt, call it the last remnant of civilized restraint in a man who had long since abandoned any pretense of civilization. He lowered the weapon. He backed away. He got in his truck and drove home, looking over his shoulder the entire way. That night, he did not sleep. He sat by the window with his rifle, watching the darkness, jumping at every sound. The woman's words echoed in his mind. What did it mean to wait? What was she waiting for? What was coming? He would find out soon enough. If this story is making you feel something right now, if you can feel the weight of what Agnes Collins is doing, leave a comment saying, "Justice has many faces." I want to know if you understand what she is going through. The winter of 1987 was brutal in Harlan Ridge. Snow fell early and stayed late. The mountain roads became impassable for days at a time. The people retreated into their homes, surviving on stored food and firewood, waiting for spring the way they always did. Death was not unusual during these months. The cold claimed the elderly and the careless. No one questioned it. Death in winter was simply part of life in the mountains. Tommy Dawson was the sixth man. He was 22 years old, the youngest and smartest of Earl's sons. Tommy had always been different from his brothers. While Marcus and Dale solved problems with their fists, Tommy used his mind. He planned. He calculated. He was the one who had orchestrated the attack on Elijah Collins, who had turned a drunken confrontation into a coordinated assault. He was the most dangerous of them all because he understood consequences and chose to act anyway. Tommy knew he was being hunted. He felt it with the same intuition that had served him so well in his short, violent life. He stopped going out at night. He moved into his father's house, where multiple armed men stood guard around the clock. He considered leaving Harlan Ridge entirely, starting over somewhere far from these mountains and the shadow that hung over his family. But leaving would mean admitting defeat, and Tommy Dawson had never been defeated. In December 1987, a package arrived at the Dawson compound. It was addressed to Tommy, no return address, postmarked from a town 40 miles away. Inside was a photograph of Elijah Collins, taken when he was alive, smiling at the camera with his arm around Sarah Whitmore. On the back of the photograph, written in neat handwriting, were the words, "Do you remember what you did?" Tommy stared at that photograph for hours. He showed it to his father. They discussed going to the sheriff. But what would they say? That someone sent an old photograph? There was nothing illegal about it. There was nothing actionable. It was simply a reminder, a message designed to torment without providing any opening for retaliation. More packages arrived over the following weeks. Each contained a photograph or a personal item connected to the victims, a lock of Sarah Whitmore's auburn hair, a page from Elijah's journal, a piece of charred wood from the cabin. Each package was postmarked from a different location, never the same town twice. Tommy tried to trace them, but the trail led nowhere. Whoever was sending these packages knew how to remain invisible. The psychological warfare was devastating. Earl Dawson's mental state deteriorated rapidly. He saw threats everywhere. He accused longtime friends of conspiring against him. He fortified his compound with booby traps and early warning systems, turning his home into a prison. His wife finally left him, moving to her sister's house 2 counties over, unable to bear the paranoia and rage that had consumed her husband. Tommy watched his father's collapse with a mixture of pity and contempt. He understood now that they were facing an enemy who could not be fought with guns or numbers. This enemy was patient, methodical, and completely without fear. This enemy had already taken 5 men and showed no signs of stopping. The only question was who would be next. On January 15, 1988, Tommy Dawson made a decision. He was going to confront Agnes Collins directly. Not with weapons, not with threats, but with an offer. He would apologize. He would confess his role in Elijah's death. He would offer whatever compensation she demanded: money, land, public acknowledgement of guilt. He would beg for her forgiveness and ask her to stop the slaughter before there was nothing left of his family. He drove to the Collins property alone, against his father's express orders. It was snowing lightly, the kind of soft, quiet snow that muffled sound and made the world feel muted and distant. He parked his truck at the end of the dirt road and walked the rest of the way, his hands visible at his sides, showing he carried no weapons. Agnes was in her garden of all places, kneeling in the snow, tending to the cold frame where she grew winter vegetables. She looked up when Tommy approached and showed no surprise. She might have been expecting him. She might have been expecting someone exactly like him, a survivor coming to negotiate terms. Tommy stood 10 feet away, his breath visible in the cold air. He spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully. He told her he was sorry for what they had done. He told her he had not pulled the rope or lit the fire, but he had been there, he had watched, he had not stopped it. He told her he understood if she could not forgive him, but he was asking anyway. He was asking for mercy. Agnes listened without expression. When Tommy finished, she rose to her feet, brushing snow from her knees. She was silent for a long moment, studying him the way one might study an insect under glass. Then she spoke. "You want forgiveness," she said. "Do you think Elijah wanted to die? Do you think Sarah wanted to burn? They wanted to live. They wanted to raise their child together. They wanted everything you and your family took from them, and now you come here asking for mercy." Tommy's voice cracked. "I know what we did was wrong. I know nothing can undo it, but more killing won't bring them back. Please, Mrs. Collins, end this. End it before there's no one left." Agnes tilted her head slightly, considering his words. "When you watched my son die, did he beg? Did he ask you to stop?" Tommy could not answer. He could not meet her eyes. "I thought so," Agnes said. "He did beg. He begged for his life. He called for me. He called for his mother to save him, and I was there, Tommy. I was there, and I could not save him. I could only watch. Do you understand what that does to a person? Do you have any idea what that destroys inside someone?" Tommy shook his head. "No," Agnes said, "you don't, but you will." She turned and walked into her house, closing the door behind her. Tommy stood in the snow for a long time, unable to move, unable to think. Finally, he walked back to his truck and drove home. He did not tell his father about the conversation. There was nothing to tell. Agnes Collins had made her position clear. There would be no mercy. There would be no negotiation. There would only be justice. Her justice, delivered on her terms. Tommy Dawson disappeared 3 weeks later. Like his brother Dale, he simply vanished. His truck was found abandoned on a mountain road, engine running, door open. Search parties found nothing. The Dawson family had lost 3 sons in less than a year, and they still had no proof that Agnes Collins was responsible. But everyone knew. The entire town knew. Whispers spread through Harlan Ridge like wildfire. Agnes Collins was killing the men who murdered her son. She was a ghost, a demon, a force of nature. She could not be stopped, could not be caught, could not be reasoned with. She was death itself, walking among them, choosing her victims with patient precision. And there were still 5 names on her list. The year 1988 dawned cold and grey over Harlan Ridge. Earl Dawson was a shell of the man he had been. He had lost everything: his sons, his wife, his reputation, his sanity. He spent his days drinking and muttering to himself, reliving the night of the lynching over and over, wondering how things had gone so wrong. He had only wanted to teach the Collins family a lesson. He had only wanted to defend his family's honor. How had it come to this? Sheriff Patterson finally began to take the deaths seriously. Not because he had suddenly developed a conscience, but because the state police were asking questions. Too many men connected to the Dawson family had died or disappeared. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Patterson launched a formal investigation, interviewing witnesses, examining evidence, building a case against the only suspect that made sense, Agnes Collins, but there was no evidence. Agnes had covered her tracks meticulously. She had alibis for every death and disappearance. She had witnesses who would swear she was home, at church, at the store, anywhere but where the violence occurred. She had never left a fingerprint, a footprint, a trace of DNA. She was invisible, untouchable, protected by years of careful planning and a community that was more afraid of the Dawsons than they were of her. Patterson brought Agnes in for questioning. She sat in the interrogation room with a pleasant smile, answering every question with patient courtesy. Yes, she was aware of the deaths. Yes, she found it tragic. No, she had no idea who was responsible. No, she harbored no grudge against the Dawson family despite what they had done to her son. She had forgiven them, she said. Vengeance was the Lord's, not hers. She was simply an old woman trying to live out her remaining years in peace. Patterson had nothing to charge her with. He had nothing to hold her on. He let her go with a warning that he would be watching her closely. Agnes thanked him for his concern and walked out of the sheriff's office with her head held high. That night the seventh man died. His name was Floyd Barker, 46, a cousin of Earl's who had helped organize the mob. Floyd was a truck driver who spent most of his time on the road, which had made him feel safe from whatever was happening in Harlan Ridge. But even the road was not safe enough. Floyd's truck was found jackknifed on a highway outside of Nashville, Tennessee. He had apparently lost control and crashed into a bridge abutment at high speed. The coroner ruled it death by misadventure. Another accident, another coincidence. The eighth man was Calvin Potts, 50, another distant relative who had been present that night. Calvin died in a house fire in February 1988. The fire department ruled it accidental, caused by a faulty space heater. Calvin had been sleeping and never woke up. His wife was visiting relatives in Ohio. She came home to a pile of ashes and a husband who had been cremated before he could be buried. The ninth man was Harold Reese, 39, a friend of Dale's who had helped hold the rope. Harold was found in his home, dead of apparent cardiac arrest. He was relatively young and had no history of heart problems, but the coroner found no evidence of foul play. Sometimes young men had heart attacks. It happened. 3 more men dead. The pattern was unmistakable now. Every man who had participated in the Collins murders was dying, one by one, in ways that looked like accidents but felt like executions. The state police launched a full investigation. They brought in forensic specialists from Louisville. They exhumed bodies and conducted new autopsies. They interviewed everyone in Harlan Ridge who might have information. But Agnes Collins remained beyond their reach. She cooperated fully with investigators. She provided alibis. She expressed sympathy for the families of the deceased. She was the picture of a grieving mother who had moved on from tragedy, not the architect of a systematic campaign of revenge. Without physical evidence, without witnesses, without confessions, there was nothing anyone could do. The people of Harlan Ridge lived in fear, not of Agnes Collins specifically, but of what her presence represented. She was proof that actions had consequences, that justice could not be escaped, that the sins of the past would eventually come due. Every man who had participated in the lynching knew his name was on the list. Every family connected to the Dawsons knew their loved ones might be next. Some fled. They packed up their belongings and left Harlan Ridge, moving to other states, changing their names, trying to disappear. But Agnes found them anyway. The 10th man died in Texas, run over by a hit-and-run driver never identified. The 11th man died in Florida, drowning in what appeared to be a boating accident. Distance was no protection. Time was no protection. Agnes Collins had resources, patience, and a determination that nothing could break. By the summer of 1988, only one man remained, Earl Dawson himself. Earl had watched his entire family destroyed. His sons were dead or missing. His relatives had fled or perished. His friends had abandoned him, afraid that proximity to Earl would make them targets. He was alone in his compound, surrounded by fortifications that protected nothing, armed with weapons he could not use against an enemy he could not see. He stopped leaving his property. He hired guards, but they quit after a few weeks, spooked by the atmosphere of dread that hung over the Dawson land. He tried to drink himself to death, but his body refused to cooperate. He prayed for deliverance, but God did not answer. He was trapped in a hell of his own making, waiting for the end. Agnes Collins came to him on September 14, 1988, exactly 17 months after the night she watched her son die. She walked up the dirt road to his compound in broad daylight, past the abandoned guard posts, past the rusting vehicles, past the overgrown gardens that had once been tended by family members who no longer existed. She walked through his front gate, up his steps, and knocked on his door. Earl answered with a shotgun in his hands. He was gaunt, unshaven, wild-eyed. He had been waiting for this moment for months. He had imagined it 1,000 times. In his fantasies, he killed her. He pulled the trigger and ended the nightmare that had consumed his life. But now that she was actually standing before him, he could not move. He could not act. He could only stare at this small, silver-haired woman who had destroyed everything he loved. "Hello, Earl," Agnes said. "May I come in?" He did not lower the shotgun. "You killed them, all of them, my boys, my kin. You killed them all." "Yes," Agnes said simply. "I did." The admission hung in the air between them. Earl had wanted a confession. He had needed to hear her say it, but now that she had, he did not know what to do with it. "Why?" he asked, though he knew the answer. "You know why," Agnes said. "You watched my son die. You watched them burn Sarah and my grandchild with her. You laughed, Earl. I heard you laugh. Did you think there would be no consequences? Did you think you could take everything from me and walk away?" Earl's hands trembled. "The law said it was an accident. The sheriff, the jury, they all said—" "The law," Agnes interrupted, her voice suddenly hard. "The law is what men like you make it. The law protected you because you had money and connections and friends in the right places. The law let you murder my son and call it justice. So I made my own law, Earl. I made a law that says every man who touches my family pays with his life." Earl sank into a chair, the shotgun falling from his grip. He was crying now, tears cutting through the grime on his face. "What do you want? What will make this stop?" Agnes looked at him with something that might have been pity. "Nothing will make this stop, Earl. Your sons are dead. Your family is gone. You have nothing left. But I am not here to kill you. Death would be too easy. Death would be mercy." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I want you to live, Earl. I want you to live a long, long time. I want you to wake up every morning and remember what you did. I want you to see Elijah's face when you close your eyes. I want you to hear Sarah's screams when you dream. I want you to spend the rest of your miserable life knowing that you destroyed everything, not just my family, but your own. You killed my son, and in doing so you killed everything you ever loved. That is my revenge, Earl. That is my justice." She turned and walked out of his house, out of his compound, down the dirt road toward her own property. Earl watched her go. He did not follow. He did not reach for his shotgun. He simply sat in his chair, surrounded by the silence of his empty home, and began to cry in earnest. Earl Dawson lived for another 12 years. He never left Harlan Ridge. He never remarried. He never rebuilt his family or his fortunes. He existed in a kind of living death, a ghost haunting the ruins of his own life. When he finally died in 2000, alone and unmourned, the few people who attended his funeral whispered that it was a mercy. They whispered that he had been dead for years, ever since Agnes Collins came to his door and showed him what his crimes had truly cost. Agnes Collins outlived her enemy by 7 years. She died in 2007 at the age of 82, surrounded by her daughter Martha and her grandchildren. The people of Harlan Ridge attended her funeral in numbers that surprised everyone. They came to pay respect to a woman who had done what the law would not do, who had avenged her son when no one else would, who had proven that justice, real justice, could not be denied forever. Her grave stands in the Collins family cemetery, next to Elijah's marker and a memorial stone for Sarah Whitmore. The inscription reads simply, "Agnes Collins, beloved mother who never forgot and never forgave." The Red Knight of the Appalachians became legend in those mountains. People still tell the story, parents to children, old-timers to newcomers. They tell it as a warning. They tell it as a reminder. They tell it to explain why. In a place where violence was common and death was familiar, people still speak of Agnes Collins with a mixture of fear and admiration. She was a mother, she was a monster, she was both, and she was neither. She was simply a woman who lost everything and decided that the men who took it would pay the price. Every single one of them. If you watched until here, it is because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can know who truly enjoys the stories on this channel. If this story moved you, if you felt the weight of Agnes Collins's journey, then please give this video a like. It helps more people find these stories. And if you know someone who appreciates tales of justice, revenge, and the darkness that lives inside all of us, share this video with them. Thank you for being part of this community. The mountains remember, and now so do you.